When Jordan Baker had finished telling all this, we had left the plaza for half an hour and were driving in a Victoria through Central Park. The sun had gone down behind the tall apartments of the movie stars in the West 50s, and the clear voices of children, already gathered like crickets on the grass, rose through the hot twilight. "I'm the Sheik of Araby, your love belongs to me. At night when you're asleep, into your tent I'll creep." It was a strange coincidence, I said. But it wasn't a coincidence at all. Why not? Gatsby bought that house so that Daisy would just be across the bay. Then, it had not been merely the stars to which he had aspired on that June night. He came alive to me, delivered suddenly from the womb of his purposeless splendor. So, the major question is, right, what motivates Gatsby, and why all the fuss with the parties and this pristine reputation, this massive castle, a house? And the answer is, Gatsby is still in love with Daisy, and he wanted to be somewhere where Daisy was just across the way. So then the question is, well, why Nick? Why is Nick the one that he's trying to essentially create this like tight relationship with? "He wants to know," continued Jordan, "if you'll invite Daisy to your house some afternoon, and then let him come over." The modesty of the demand shook me. He had waited 5 years and bought a mansion where he dispensed starlight to casual moths so that he could come over some afternoon to a stranger's garden? Did I have to know all this before he could ask such a little thing? He's afraid. He's waited so long. He thought you might be offended. You see, he's a regular tough underneath it all. Something worried me. Why didn't he ask you to arrange a meeting? "He wants her to see his house," she explained, "and your house is right next door." Oh. "I think he half expected her to wander into one of his parties some night," went on Jordan, "but she never did. Then he began asking people casually if they knew her, and I was the first one he found. It was that night he sent me for at his dance. You should have heard the elaborate way he worked up to it. Of course, I immediately suggested a luncheon in New York, and I thought he'd go mad. 'I don't want to do anything out of the way,' he kept saying. 'I want to see her right next door.' When I said you are a particular friend of Tom's, he started to abandon the whole idea. He doesn't know very much about Tom, though he says he's read a Chicago paper for years, just on the off chance of catching a glimpse of Daisy's name." It was dark now, and as we dipped under a little bridge, I put my arm around Jordan's golden shoulder and drew her toward me and asked her to dinner. Suddenly, I wasn't thinking of Daisy and Gatsby anymore, but of this clean, hard, limited person who dealt in universal skepticism and who leaned back jauntily just within the circle of my arm. A phrase began to beat in my ears with a sort of heady excitement. "There are only the pursued, the pursuing, the busy, and the tired." "And Daisy ought to have something in her life," murmured Jordan to me. Does she want to see Gatsby?" She's not to know about it. Gatsby doesn't want her to know. You're just supposed to invite her to tea." We passed a barrier of dark trees, and then the facade of 59th Street. A block of delicate pale light beamed down into the park. Unlike Gatsby and Tom Buchanan, I had no girl whose disembodied face floated along the dark cornices and blinding signs, and so I drew up the girl beside me, tightening my arms. Her wan, scornful mouth smiled, and so I drew her up again closer, this time to my face. So the chapter ends with, obviously, Nick and Jordan kissing, but the 2 pages in between are really important. So we know that Gatsby has done all of this elaboration, all of this day in order to give himself a good reputation and in order for Nick to essentially just invite Daisy over to his house for tea, because Gatsby wants to just kind of stop in and, reintroduce himself. And Gatsby's highly nervous, right? He's had this girl that he's been in love with since 1917, who has gotten married, who represents old money and this social strata that he was never able to get to when he was a lieutenant. And so now he has made something of himself. He has this name throughout all of New York that everyone knows, and it's all for this one girl. Here you've kind of got this great love story starting to happen. And it's like Romeo and Juliet, kind of, in that, Romeo and Juliet have these warring families of Montague and Capulet, and rather than it being warring families, it's completely warring social classes, old money and new money. And Jordan's big argument is, well, Daisy should have something, right? She loved this guy at first, and she's married to this complete, total jerk, and isn't treated well. So why not, right? So Jordan along with Gatsby and Nick, are now trying to rearrange this meeting, which is going to happen in the next chapter. And you can imagine, after 5 years, and literally everything in your life is geared towards making something of yourself, not for just you, but in order to get the girl, and how that first meeting is going to happen. And it's very, very entertaining. So a couple things. So at the end of chapter 1, there was that quote, right? And I asked you guys a question in the Google form about the green light, you know, and it says, but I didn't call him Nick says, but I didn't call to him, for he gave a sudden intimation that he was content to be alone. He stretched his arms toward the dark water in a curious way, and as far as I was from him, I could have sworn he was trembling. And so who lives across the bay from him, now that we know? It's the Buchanan's house. And so when Nick first sees him across that dock, he sees Gatsby stretching out his arms towards Daisy and the house that Daisy lives in. And of course, only he knows that. Daisy doesn't know. Jordan and Nick at this point don't know. But now, at the end of chapter 4, we do. We know that Gatsby is reaching out across the bay for Daisy. And there's way more symbolic undertones for this, but I want to get into that a little bit later. And then finally, there's this beautiful line. There are only the pursued, the pursuing, the busy, and the tired. And each of the main characters, from Myrtle and George Wilson to Nick and Jordan, Tom and Daisy and Gatsby, fall into one of those 4 categories. So this is where the book really starts to pick up. We've gotten all the backstory. We know who all the characters are. We know the complicated relationships. And now it's this question of what's going to happen. So hopefully you guys are enjoying it so far.